Okay, so we're going to be continuing with period 8. We're in early Cold War stuff, so now we're going to be getting to our next, I guess you would say, like big hot spot in these early years of the Cold War. So if you remember what the United States and the rest of the Allies decided to do with Germany and Europe after World War II, that's essentially what they decided to do with Asia as well. If you remember, during World War II, Japan had conquered pretty much all of Asia, and the same way that Germany had conquered so much of Europe. And to monitor that reconstruction, they decided to divide up the different countries and pieces of Asia the same way that they had Germany and the rest of Europe. So Korea, which had been one land for, ever, was divided into two countries, North Korea and South Korea, the same way we created an East Germany and a West Germany. And they were divided at the 38th parallel, which is still the division between the two today. So, a little bit of background. Even before Japan conquered Korea during World War II, Korea has been, it's a smaller nation, and it has been the victim of repeated invasion and conquering by China and Japan for hundreds of years. It's basically been a trading game back and forth between the Chinese and the Japanese. And every time they've been conquered by one of those nations, it has come with a lot of bloodshed, a lot of loss of life for the Korean people. So there's definitely a cultural difference there, even between Korea and the rest of Asia, because there's a lot of paranoia and xenophobia, not of Western foreigners, but of even other Asian foreigners. And along with that comes a lot of ethnic pride, a lot of pride in the Korean people for being able to, I guess, thrive in the face of all of that chaos for so long. So when North Korea and South Korea were divided, they definitely weren't happy about that. The same way the Germans wanted to be united, the same way the Irish wanted to be united. No one nationality or race of people wanted to be divided from their, I guess you would say, their brothers and sisters. So Russia was placed in charge of monitoring the, I guess you would say, reconstruction, or just the future of the northern piece, and the rest of the Allies, but mostly the United States, were going to monitor what was happening in South Korea. And a young communist revolutionary came to power in the northern part, in charge of the Communist Party. Obviously, the Russians and the new, the Chinese Empire, which has just become communist as well, are obviously going to support a communist revolution in the part that they're closest to and monitoring. So the new leader of North Korea would be a man named Kim Il-sung. Now, I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, there's so many Kims and stuff, which Kim is the right Kim? So there are, I'm sure you know, 3 Kims: Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un is the current dictator and leader of North Korea. He is the grandson of this original Kim Il-sung. And if you don't know a lot about Asian cultures, they consider the group or the family to be most important. The community is more important than the individual. That's very much a strong piece of a lot of Asian cultures. And so when they introduce themselves, they say their last name first, because they say what family or what group or what community they're part of. So a lot of people who don't know much about Asia are oh, why are they all named Kim? No, that's their last name. They're a family. It's like the Kennedys or the Roosevelts or the Bushes. That's their last name. They didn't name all their sons Kim. So Kim Jong-il, that's the second one. Kim Il-sung, the first one, he came to power in 1950. And when he came to power in North Korea, he wanted to unite the Koreas, which was something that a lot of the Korean people wanted, but the Southern Korean people did not want a communist takeover. And in 1950, he crossed the parallel line and invaded into South Korea. So at that point, it became a war between North Korea and South Korea, basically a civil war. But what's our policy on communism? Keep that in mind. Our policy is all in one word, right? Containment. If communism is going to grow in North Korea, we want it to stay there, right? There's no way we're going to let it grow into South Korea. But also, this isn't technically our job or business. Granted, we have things like the Truman Doctrine that say we'll like help anyone defend themselves from communism, and we totally will. But this isn't like a growing communist group within South Korea trying to overthrow its own government. It's a straight up war. One country has invaded and attacked another. So that actually sounds like something for the United Nations, right? That's a job for the UN to keep all of this peace. So the UN voted at the request of the United States. The UN voted and to authorize UN troops to serve basically in what would be called a police action and serve in the Korean War. So tons of troops, not only from the United States, but from every country, really, in the UN. I mean, Zimbabwe, like everyone was sending troops into the Korean War, but definitely the largest percentage of foreign troops that were members of the UN military were definitely American. And they were under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who is still in the Pacific and has been in the Pacific since World War II. If you remember, he led our troops in the defeat against Japan all through the Pacific during World War II. So MacArthur is still in charge. And what we're going to see actually is some of the most difficult fighting ever to take place in the Korean War. Remember, MacArthur, he was there from day one in the Pacific to the very end, VJ Day, right? And he said that the fighting that he was witnessing and the savage military tactics from both sides happening during the Korean War was 1,000 times worse. And it didn't take long before China started to back up North Korea, and they were sending in troops as well. So now we have North Korea and South Korea fighting each other, the United States and the UN powers trying to restore the border, push North Korea out of South Korea, and Chinese troops trying to support North Korea and make sure that UN troops don't enter North Korean border. So it was definitely a total cluster. And really at this time, a lot of Americans probably couldn't even point to Korea on a map. You know what I mean? Other than probably hearing about it vaguely during World War II, they probably didn't even hear much. But had they, that would have been the only time most Americans even really thought about a country like Korea. And now, just getting out of this war, 5 years later, we're sending troops into another one. There wasn't necessarily a lot of support, and we had definitely reached a stalemate where both of our troops were sort of locked in on that parallel border, not really making a lot of headway one way or the other. So Harry Truman, when he ran for re-election, that was one thing that a lot of people were critical of. They were like, we want this whole thing to be over. And MacArthur also wanted this to be over, and he was very stern that what we needed to do, because the fighting was so intense, was we needed to return with very strong firepower. And what is the very strong firepower we have at our disposal? Nuclear weapons. So MacArthur wrote to the press, spoke to the president, spoke to the Department of Defense a million times, and was adamant that we needed to send more troops. If we weren't going to send more troops, we needed more weapons. If we didn't have more weapons, we needed to use bigger weapons. And he really wanted to nuke North Korea. That was something he was strongly advocating for. And Harry Truman just flat out was like, no, like, we did that, okay, and look at all that. Look at all the damage it did, but also look at what we had to get to that point, right? Like, we went through all of World War II before we decided to use a weapon like that. And it was truly a last resort. And Truman's thinking, that we're not in last resort like a scenario. You're jumping too far ahead. And MacArthur's saying back, we are in a last resort scenario. You don't know. You're not there. You don't understand. So they were butting heads a lot, and MacArthur ended up going to the media and basically saying, like, Truman's a freaking idiot. And he doesn't know what he's doing. He's a terrible leader, blah, 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 blah. Well, at the end of the day, whether or not he agrees, Harry Truman is the commander-in-chief of the military, which means he's Douglas MacArthur's boss. You can't go to the press and talk crap about your boss and think you're going to keep your job. It very much undermines the authority of the president, the office of the presidency. So Harry Truman fires Douglas MacArthur, which he said he couldn't have made any other decision and still called himself the president, meaning as the president of the United States, when my authority isn't respected in that way, I can't actually consider myself to truly hold that office if I'm not willing to defend it. But there were still plenty of people who were unhappy with that choice because MacArthur was a war hero who led us through such a long and grueling experience in the Pacific. A lot of people still really loved and respected him. So when Harry Truman ran for re-election, a lot of Americans were like, we want out of this war. We're mad that you fired MacArthur. The man that the Republicans chose to nominate against him was former General Dwight D. Eisenhower. If you remember Eisenhower, if you don't want to write Eisenhower over and over in your notes, you should write it one time and then write Ike, I-K-E. That was his nickname. His campaign slogan was, I like Ike. And he had this little cartoon that would run on TV. They would sing this I Like Ike song. But anyway, Eisenhower, he's definitely like a military mind, right? He's led our troops in Africa. He led the invasion in Italy. He commanded our troops through Europe and D-Day. He's a big deal. He's a war hero. And he immediately gets into his campaign saying, you vote for me, I'm going to get us out of Korea immediately. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the Korean War comes to an end. Eisenhower wins, and 6 months into his presidency, he goes to Korea himself. He and the rest of the parties involved organize a meeting between the UN, China, North Korea, and South Korea, and all of us sign an armistice, which is essentially a ceasefire, right? Where we agree to stop fighting and recognize the parallel once again as the border between North Korea and South Korea. Now, we don't have to sign a treaty, and neither does China, because none of us declared war on anyone, right? Really, the United States wasn't even like the party involved. We were operating as an agent of the United Nations, and the UN didn't declare war on anyone, so they don't need to sign a treaty. A treaty to undo a war declaration only needs to be signed by North Korea and South Korea. And since we just needed an armistice, we signed the armistice, and we get out and we're done. But where does that leave North Korea and South Korea? Well, it leaves them not fighting, but legally, technically, it does leave them still at war with each other. Legally speaking, those two countries have been at war with each other ever since. So much long afterwards, in 2018, President Trump did hold a summit. I'm sure you remember hearing and seeing about this on the news, with the current ruler and dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, to sign a peace treaty, or at least propose one. And they did propose one. It's called the Peace Treaty on the Korean Peninsula. And like I said, it's at this point in time, March of 2020. It is still just a proposed treaty. It has not been signed. It is not official. So technically still, the Korean War is still on. And the border between North Korea and South Korea has remained ever since it was divided. The border is now known as the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, which is kind of funny because it's actually like the most heavily militarized location in the world. Extremely dangerous. If you've watched any documentaries about North Korean refugees or defectors, it's extremely difficult to get out. It's the hardest way to get out is to get across the DMZ. If you see this picture down here, this is what the current DMZ looks like. If you see this right here, this is like a concrete marker, and this is basically where you see where these blue buildings are. They sit across the border. From this marker to this marker way back here, that's right there, all of that is pretty much like the border. And these blue buildings are the only places that North Korea and South Korea can meet to talk with each other. They're like conference centers that sit across the border. And there are North Korean soldiers on this side and South Korean and UN soldiers, still American soldiers, on this side, and they monitor each other and watch each other all the time. It's kind of a ridiculous thing. If you want more, if you're very interested in North Korea and what's going on with them, that's something that I personally find super interesting. Had we been in class, we would have watched the Lisa Ling documentary Inside North Korea, where Lisa Ling, who's an American reporter, she went undercover in North Korea in, I want to say like maybe like 2006 or something. I'm pretty sure I was in high school, but and she was like the first American to bring cameras into North Korea, and she filmed some footage at the DMZ. It's pretty interesting. So I definitely recommend maybe trying to look that up on YouTube. But she went back later, I do believe maybe last year or the year before, and filmed like some update stuff. So those might be some interesting things to look up if you're really interested. Otherwise, if you go down the North Korean documentary rabbit hole and you want other good documentaries, just let me know. But the Korean War is definitely, we would call this, I guess you would say, a proxy war, and it will be one of others, several situations to come. What's going on in Berlin, the first Berlin crisis, that's sort of like a proxy situation, or that's not really a proxy situation, that's like straight up. But this is definitely a proxy war. Vietnam's going to be a proxy war. And by proxy, what we mean is that the United States and Russia are the true agitators, right? We are really I guess you would say, like the puppet masters. And we're using North Korea and South Korea, or North Vietnam and South Vietnam, as our basically puppets fighting each other, when really we don't care about beating North Korea. We care about beating the communists, and they don't care about beating South Korea. They care about beating the capitalists. And that's how we're going to see conflict after conflict, and several of these hot spots pop up as the rest of the 20th century is going to continue.